historic grand round, the first grand rounds jointly between MGH and BWH. So welcome everyone who's out there online. For those of you who don't know me, I am John Astor, Deputy Chair of Pathology here at Brigham. And as is traditional, I'm going to start by telling you a few things about the man this lecture is named for, Dr. Stanley Robbins, and then I'll move on to our speaker for today, Andrea Dayrup. So Dr. Robbins was born in 1915 in Portland, Maine, actually. He's always been a New Englander, always was a New Englander, but moved to Boston early in his life, graduated from Brookline High School, went to MIT, and then did medical school at Tufts, and managed to be valedictorian in both of those places in his graduating class. And then moved on to train at the Mallory Institute of Pathology after a surgical internship, and joined the staff at the Mallory Institute and the Boston University School of Medicine. He progressed through the system, became professor of pathology at BU in 1957, was the chairman of the Department of Pathology at BU from 1964 to 1979, director of the Mallory Institute from 1966 to 1972, and in 1980 came here to the Brigham as a senior pathologist and visiting professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School, a position he held until 1995. He was a man who had enormous influence on the discipline of pathology, but I think it's undoubtedly true that his most enduring contribution is through his books. He first published a book called The Textbook of Pathology in 1957, which interestingly was panned by pathologists at the time. They thought there wasn't enough morphology and too much clinical information. But as it turns out, medical students loved it. And so the users spoke, and it became quite a popular textbook over the next couple of editions. Eventually, it morphed into what we now know as Pathologic Basis of Disease in 1974. He also published a companion textbook, Basic Pathology, in 1971, a sort of shorter, condensed version of Pathologic Basis of Disease. Although initially it was also a very much clinically oriented textbook. It actually had chapters in it entitled things like cough or other kinds of symptoms rather than focused on disease systems, for example. So since that time, these two books have been translated into over a dozen languages and continue to be used worldwide. Books are a little bit out of favor these days, but as sales have dropped a bit here in the United States, they've actually increased internationally. For example, Basic Pathology, this last edition, the 10th edition, sold over 50,000 copies in India alone. So this book series really continues to have a very large national and international impact in the field of pathology education. And I think there's little doubt that through his books, Robbins really became the most influential teacher in pathology over the course of many decades. And one of his aphorisms to write by was that there's no good writing, there's only good rewriting. And over the past several years, I've had the pleasure of writing and rewriting several books with today's speaker, Andrea Dayrup. First, Essential Pathology, which is really geared to the integrated classroom, as well as the 11th edition of Basic Pathology, which we're just hopefully putting to bed sometime in the next couple of months. Andrea, by way of background, graduated from Princeton University, did training in anatomic pathology at the University of Chicago after doing an MD PhD at Chicago. Did a fellowship in soft tissue pathology at Emory, joined the faculty in pathology at South Carolina for a time, and then moved to her current position at Duke in 2015, where she's risen to the status of professor of pathology as of 2021. I found her to be an absolutely outstanding, passionate teacher of pathology. In recent years, she's turned her focus to the way that race has been historically represented or perhaps misrepresented. We'll hear more about that today in curricula and in textbooks, including the Robbins series. And it's this work that she's going to be sharing with us today. So thank you very much for coming, Andrea, and welcome.
Hello, so thank you very much. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. Not advancing. Oh, okay. So I first gave a talk called Race and Robbins Data or Distraction on March 6, 2021. Since that time, we have presented to numerous pathology groups. These are ones that we've done in the last 18 months, as well as a few that are scheduled the next couple of months. But this is a topic that is not just of interest to pathologists, despite the focus on Robbins. We actually have spoken to a number of clinical departments across the country, and we're doing our first international talk in 2 weeks in Toronto. Now, you may have noticed I've used the term we. This is not the royal we. I co-present with Dr. Joe Graves Jr., who is a evolutionary biologist at the North Carolina A&T State University. He has published widely on race and medicine. His most recent book is his memoir, Voice of the Wilderness. And a book that really helped me to get a good understanding was The Emperor's New Clothes from 2001. I do have a background in evolutionary biology. That was my major at Princeton. So many people ask me, how did you get interested in looking at race and medicine? And since I'm an educator, and as with so many educators, it began with a student. So on February 11th of 2020, one of the medical students emailed her pathology small group leader and said, this was on week 3 of a 5-month course, and she said, I'd like to discuss the evidence related to racial disparities in blood pressure. As a class, we've received a great deal of conflicting information as it relates to race and health disparities. Now at Duke, we have a longitudinal course called Cultural Determinants of Health and Health Disparities. And in that course, students were taught that race is never really a useful proxy and or risk factor in healthcare, but other courses reinforce this category. So she wanted to discuss why race is so widely used, the evidence behind the practice, and what are the factors that contribute to this disparity. So I met with a small group instructor, we met with the students, we discussed our views on race and medicine. The students were satisfied and all was good. Now I mentioned the date because this is a very critical time in our history, because just a couple weeks later, Ahmaud Arbery was shot to death while jogging in Georgia. A few weeks after that, Breonna Taylor was shot to death in her apartment. And as we all know, over Memorial Day weekend, George Floyd was slowly asphyxiated by a law enforcement officer. And this came on a background of far too many deaths due to white supremacy. These are just some of the ones that were more notable in the media. And I think it's important to point this out because, particularly with the death of George Floyd, many of us stopped to assess where we were and what we were doing. I had always considered myself to be a good liberal. I was not a racist. I was a good person. But this really raised the issue for me. Was I doing enough? Was there more I could do? And this is a graphic that I've seen in some equity learning. We have our circle of concern, what we care about, and then we have a smaller circle of influence, what we can do something about. And right square in the middle of that circle was Robbins Basic Pathology. Because Dr. Kumar had invited me to join the editorial team of this book just a few months earlier. Now, I had noticed race and medicine in this textbook again and again, but hadn't given it much thought until this particular point in time. And to get an idea of the depth and breadth of the issue, I searched the electronic book using terms like Caucasian, African, Asian, just to see what turned up. And I found more than 35 diseases for which there was some sort of disparity, either prognosis or incidence, associated with socially defined race. Now, let's take a look at how this actually shows up in that 10th edition. We have African Americans and cardiac amyloidosis, carrier frequency of cystic fibrosis in Caucasians, cholesterol gallstones in Native Americans, and factor V Leiden mutation in whites. Now, let's set aside for the moment the question of terminology because some of this is clearly outdated. And let's remember 2 things. First of all, this is not unique to Robbins, right? So we see this all throughout the literature and in all the textbooks. And the second thing is to keep in mind the fact that these sentences were written with the best of intentions, with the belief that these epidemiologic data would help future physicians to develop a broad yet focused differential diagnosis, to order and interpret appropriate laboratory tests, and ultimately to design appropriate treatment. So these sentences were written with the best of intentions. But as we all know, it's not enough to simply say, I have good intentions. We have to ask, are we causing harm? So are we causing harm? I believe we are, and there are three areas I'd like to look at. The first is one I call buzzword bingo. We take very bright, very motivated students, and we teach them simple word associations. White, cystic fibrosis; black, sickle cell. And we reinforce this through case vignettes and scenarios, through our quizzes, our exams, the boards and board prep material. Now let's take a look at some of this board prep material. This comes from a website called crashingresident.com. This was published in 2015, so a short 7 years ago. This is a somewhat sarcastic range of advice for students preparing to take their step one. Be as racist as possible. Now, as your eyes glide over this, I imagine some of you are feeling uncomfortable, but at the same time, you're probably feeling a sense of recognition, because I know that I learned all of these things when I was preparing for the boards myself. Now, this is just a simple board prep that's put out by an individual. Let's look at something a little bit more academic. Now, we can't look at the actual USMLE questions. So these two researchers in 2017 did the next best thing. They analyzed the question bank for step one of UWorld. I actually spoke with the CEO of UWorld about race in medicine several months ago. And he said that this is a resource that's used by over 400,000 people a year. About 250,000 of them are in the health professions. Now, what Dr. Griffin Braun did was they looked at a more than 2,200 question database, and they looked to see how many times race and ethnicity were mentioned. In addition, they cataloged whether the mention was descriptive, purely descriptive, had nothing to do with the question. The person just happened to be Black or Asian or Hispanic, or whether knowing that person's race or ethnicity was central to getting the question correct. Now, as we can see, let's focus here on white/Caucasian. You can see about 93% of the time, the person just happened to be white and nothing to do with getting to the correct answer. And about 7% of the time, it was central. And this was going to be hypertension, coronary artery disease, and cystic fibrosis. For some reason, those two diseases, coronary artery disease and hypertension, were very closely associated in this database with this socially defined race. Now, there's something a bit problematic about this, which is that this accounts for about 86% of the total mentions. And if you compare that to the percentage of this socially defined race in the 2020 census, you can see that it's overrepresented. So we have something here which is often referred to as centering whiteness. And while that is problematic, I think even more challenging is when we look at the Native American combination here. And you can see that if there's a Native American in your vignette, it's not because they brushed up against poison ivy or hit by a car. It's because they are Native American. They have gallstones, they have severe combined immunodeficiency, they have lactase deficiency. So you may be saying, well, you know, Dara, these are just the preclinical years, and surely as our students go onto the wards and become residents and attendings, they're going to learn that the vast spectrum of health and disease, and this won't matter. And I will tell you, there are things I learned at the University of Chicago 20 plus years ago that I did not learn were false until I began seriously looking at race in medicine. So the next question, of course, is, are we causing patient harm? And again, I think the answer is yes. So imagine a young Navajo woman presents to an acute care clinic. She's got right upper quadrant pain, and the attending thinks, oh, Native American, got big gallstones, and doesn't check for ectopic pregnancy or acute appendicitis, either of which can kill the patient. Now, again, you may be saying, no, Dara, we've got checks and balances, we have algorithms, this doesn't happen. Here's a report from the literature looking at cystic fibrosis. This is a tale of a patient who was not diagnosed until she was 8 years old, despite presenting multiple times with suspicious symptoms. And in fact, she was only diagnosed by a clinician who literally could not see her skin. A radiologist who saw a chest film and said, who's the kid with cystic fibrosis? And then as long as we're looking at this, and this is a critical piece, I think we have to step back even further and say, is there a way we're contributing to societal harm? Are we lifting up one population and putting down another, saying bad genes, risky behaviors, non-compliant? Are we setting up some sort of hierarchy? And to clarify this, I'm going to redline for you the diseases in Robbins' 10th edition that are associated more predominantly with African Americans compared to European Americans. So I do think that we are causing some issues as far as societal harm goes. What about our learners? So this is a quote from Damon Tweedy's book, Black Man in a White Coat. Dr. Tweedy was a medical student at Duke. He's now on the faculty. And he says in this book, it seemed that no matter the body part or organ system affected, the lecturers would sound a familiar refrain. It's more common in blacks than in whites. Each time the demographics of a new disease came up in a lecture, my stomach twisted. I knew where this was heading. Seated in a sea of mostly white and Asian faces, I wondered how this information affected their views of Black people, whether they already had biases against us, and whether any of this impacted the way they saw me. So perhaps the question is not, is race in Robbins' data or distraction, but is it detrimental? Now let's focus on this term race. What do we mean by this? So in modern biology, race is defined by two criteria: the amount of genetic variation within and between groups, and phylogenetic evidence of unique lineage. Now, because of population admixture, there is no unique lineage, and it has long been known that humans show more variability within so-called races than between them. Now, we do have geographically based genetic and physical differences, but we share 99.9% of our DNA. And so while biological race does not exist, socially defined or socially constructed race does. And this is the arbitrary use of aspects of morphology, geography, culture, etc., in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. So it's important to recognize that racism precedes race. There is no biological category. We need to maintain a social dominance hierarchy, so we create race. And that's why Dr. Graves' book with Dr. Alan Goodman is called Racism, Not Race. Now, this is being increasingly recognized. This comes from the Introduction to Epidemiology, published in 2017, saying explicitly, race is a socially constructed variable based on the idea that some human populations are distinct from others according to external physical characteristics or places of origin. Furthermore, he goes on to say racial or ethnic variations in health-related states or events are explained primarily by exposure or vulnerability to behavioral, psychosocial, material, or environmental risk factors and resources. So that's a very important thing for us to remember. So as I mentioned, racism preceded race. Here we have from the 18th century, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's, the classic categories of the races of man. And if we jump forward 200 years, you will see that not much has changed. So these are the categories that are used not only by the census, but we can see this in databases such as SEER. So we have, for example, white, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. And the question here is how much? At what point is one considered white? Particularly if you consider that Black or African American is a person having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. Again, how much? What do you do if you have parents who come from different socially defined races? Furthermore, we have to keep in mind that Africa has more genetic variability than all the rest of the world. So what is this telling us about Black or African Americans? If we look at the American Indian category here, it's not only having an origin in the original peoples of North, South, and Central America, but you also have to maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. So this means your research participant who is American Indian who decides to leave the tribe for whatever reason now is no longer American Indian. And then if we look at Asian, you can see here it's original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, and they proceed to list this long series of countries. And if you appreciate the geographic size of Asia, you can recognize that this actually does seem somewhat ridiculous. And if we look at Native Hawaiian, again, the question comes up, how much does it take to be one of these categories? So we're talking here about geography. So let's link geography and socially defined race disease. So we can see here, this is a map showing the distribution of a variety of hemoglobinopathies. And as brilliant physicians and medical students, we all know that the hemoglobinopathies are associated with selective advantage in the heterozygote state for malaria. We can see here that we have a long stretch of thalassemia, which crosses from the continent of Asia into Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. And this area that we see here in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have hemoglobin S, is where we have a lot of pressure here. Now, as you look at this, one of the things you can appreciate is this has to do with the distribution of mosquitoes and malaria. It doesn't have to do with political boundaries or even continental boundaries. So we can't really say anything particularly meaningful about any country or continent. Furthermore, as one of the things that's incredibly important is that because of globalization, we have mass migration of people. And so we can't simply say that this is where this person originated, therefore this is what we anticipate will be their disease risk. When we add immigration and globalization to population admixture, things get very complicated indeed. So this is a paper looking at ancestry informative markers, and we're going to begin by looking at individuals of African ancestry in the United States. And you can see here that there is a wide range of European ancestry, more than 30% in West Virginia and in Washington State, and in other areas there's much less. So this is significant about the mean is about 16% European ancestry. Now things get even more complicated when we look at Latin American ancestry, because this is a triad mixture of European, African, and Amerindian. And you can see here that we tend to refer to these groups as if they are a homogeneous mass, but even looking at this, we can say in this country it varies significantly by state. So you may be thinking, okay, well, you know, we can't go with race, but we could go with ethnicity. In fact, ethnicity is the new race, is where we seem to be going. And if you look at this map, looking at genetic ancestry of Latin American populations, you might say, okay, we've got something going on here. We've got 72% European in Puerto Rico compared to only 18% in Peru. So this is meaningful. But we want to caution you again, let's look just at Colombia, where you can see it's about 64% European. Admixture is going to depend upon history. So if you look at the urban center of Medellin, and look at the genetics of these individuals, you can see that their admixture mimics what we see across much of the country. But if you look in the nearby state of Chocó, which was a site of plantation agriculture and had chattel slaves, you can see here that it's very different. So we can't say anything about even Colombia. So race is not a biologically useful concept. I hope we all agree with that. So why is race so prevalent in medicine? Well, one reason is that we're very interested in looking at the causes of disparities. And there are some intrinsic causes of disparities. So we have selective advantage, such as sickle cell and thalassemias, but that's related, as I demonstrated, to geography, not to socially defined race. Now we have founder effect and population bottlenecks that would account for the increased incidence of severe combined immunodeficiency in the Navajo and the Jicarilla Apache, but not races. It's not uniform to American Indians, it's these two populations. And then we have endogamy, which means marriage within, but let's be specific, breeding within one's particular group, be it religion, caste, or geography. Now, this is a very significant factor. I'd like to share with you a very interesting paper from Nature Genetics in 2017 that was looking at the genetics in South Asia. So this is a map of different groups they looked at. They genotyped 263 different groups based on caste, geography, family ties, etc. You can see them depicted here. Most of them were in India, and the different colors represent their linguistic groups. And they found that of these 263, 81 groups showed a loss of genetic variation more extreme than the Finns and the Ashkenazi Jews, which are two groups that we traditionally associate with high rates of recessive genetic diseases. Now, they found one group of Visya ancestry that had a 100-fold higher rate of material cholinesterase deficiency. And for this group, they know that certain muscle relaxants are contraindicated. Now, we don't take these data and say, you know, we shouldn't give these particular muscle relaxants to Indians. And we don't say we shouldn't give them to Asians, which is where Indians fall. We have to recognize that this is particular for this population. It is not racial. So we have these intrinsic causes, and we spend a lot of time and effort and money looking at allele distributions, trying to find a biological explanation for these racial differences. But let me state explicitly, this comes from an article from the New England Journal of Medicine. I say the central observations remain. Variation is continuous and discordant with race. Systemic variation according to continent is very limited, and there is no evidence that the units of interest for medical genetics correspond to what we call races. And yet, we still look. So what is it that is causing these disparities, which are significant? We have maternal mortality, which is extremely high in Black women and American Indian women. I use the terms that are used in the papers. We have the fact that death rates are much higher for almost every malignancy in African Americans in this country. And then let's look at a complex disease like hypertension. If you look at these two maps, you might initially think that whites have more hypertension than blacks because there's more of this red area. But the reason it looks this way is because they've skewed their scale. If you look at the prevalence, this is what it would look like for blacks in our country. So there are clearly very large disparities based on socially defined race. And what is causing them? It's not a big secret. We don't need to spend a lot of money researching this. We know it's poverty, access to care, living conditions, exposure to toxins, stress, health insurance, and then overlying all of this are individual, institutional, and systemic racism. So what do we do, right, when we recognize this as a problem? So this is where I am. I have my circle of influence. So this is what I propose, not only for this book, but also looking at curricula, a careful analysis of the data, an eye towards inclusivity, and we have to provide context. So the first question is it even true? So when I had that list of the more than 35 diseases, what I did for my own peace of mind and for my medical students is I did a deep dive into the literature for each of these diseases. This generated a document of about 85 pages with figures and references, which I'm happy to share. I've shared it with some people here already. And I provide that for my medical students. But it was also the background I knew I was going to need as we tackled race in Robbins. So is it even true? So seeing the sentence from the 10th edition of Robbins Basic Pathology, 10th edition, I said to the editor of that chapter, you know, I removed that part there. And his somewhat terse reply was, this is what it says in Up to Date. Now, because I'd written my disparities document, I had read Up to Date. In fact, I'd also read reference 5 and about another 30 references on keloids. Now, this is one of the statements from reference 5, Robles and Berg, that caught my eye. It talks about the risk of developing keloids is about 15 times higher in dark-skinned individuals compared with whites. Now, 15 times is a big number, so it happened to stick in my mind, also because I saw it again and again and again. I think the index papers is one by Brissett in 2001, because that was the first time I found this quote. Let's see what Brissett had to say. Brissett says, in a review of 175 cases of keloids from various races, the authors found that keloids were 15 times more likely to occur in darker-skinned individuals. 15. Well, let's look at that paper by Al-Hadi and Saganathara from 1969. It was done in Malaysia, which is why they're looking at Chinese, Indians, and Malays. And what they actually said in their paper is that the relatively fair-skinned Chinese appear to be slightly more prone to keloids than the dark-skinned Indians and Malays. Now, I did the math, and I didn't come up with anything close to 15. But the issue here is also the arrow was pointing in the wrong direction, but this still has been propagated through the literature. But that's not what the editor brought to my attention. It was this 5 to 16%. So let's take a look and see where that comes from. So I had to go back through lots and lots of papers because this number kept showing up, but it wasn't in original research. And then finally I found it. May 17th, 1931. This paper is in French, so if you're trying to read it, you may not be able to, but I can read French. This is a report from a dermatologic meeting in Strasbourg. And in that meeting, Mr. Lespin gave a talk on tattoos and keloids in Negroes of the Congo. And as so often happens in scientific meetings, at the end of his presentation, someone stood up and rather than ask a question, presented his own research. And what he said was, this is Mr. Staub, says, you know, that was very interesting, but let me tell you what I saw in the Congo. I was able to look at 1,205 Black adult workers, and let's just pause here and think about the colonial exploitation that is summed up in that sentence. And what he did is he looked at them over this time period, and he found that 16% of them had keloids. So that number has gone through 90 years and was actually in Up to Date up until November of last year when I let them know problems there. Now, this is problematic enough, but let's look at what exactly is so bad. At that very same meeting on May 17, 1931 in Strasbourg, someone else presented his research. This is Monsieur Professor Nagli from Bern, Switzerland, and he too was interested in keloids. So what he did was he looked at this Swiss population, and he looked at adults and children, and what he found was that 13.3% of Swiss adults had keloids. Now, which is the number that comes down to us through the decades? Which is the number that, I mean, if you look at this, I would say, maybe it's statistically significant, but it's certainly not any clinical significance. But this 16% and the increased risk of keloids has come to us again and again. So I presented all of this to the editor, and this is what we came up with, right? After hours and hours and hours, this is what we have. Keloid formation seems to be an individual predisposition, which it is. Now, you may be thinking, it's just keloids, and keloids are very interesting. And, I'm a soft tissue pathologist, and keloids were never anything we discussed at great length. But it actually is very important. So I got an email from a family practice professor in California, because when I put this together, I've been making little videos. I have a website, pathologycentral.org, race and medicine videos, as well as undergraduate medical education videos. And I put one together, a 21-minute video on keloids, unheard of. And I sent that on to Up to Date, and they fixed theirs. And she had seen my video, and she sent it to her hospital system. And she said, we've got race-based medicine in our monkeypox vaccination recommendations. And I was able to get them to remove it. I said, that's great, thank you. 3 days later, I get a call, actually I get an email from someone in the office of the California State Department of Public Health saying, we'd like to talk with you about this video of yours. Can you meet with us? And of course, I brought in Dr. Graves because we are a team. This is what it said on the California Department of Public Health. It mentions, we've been trying to extend the amount of vaccine that we can use. So intradermal administration can increase up to five-fold our amount. But the incidence of keloid scarring is higher in darker pigmented individuals of African, Hispanic, and possibly Asian descent. And there is that 16%. So Dr. Graves and I met with the researcher. I showed him, I actually translated the paper for him. And 3 days later, race-based medicine is gone. Now, this is very important. This has public health implications. We're talking about individuals who already have vaccine hesitancy. Now, the next thing that happens, though, and I found this again and again, is that when you provide this fabulous evidence, someone is going to say, but what about this paper? This paper proves that keloids are more common in people of African descent. So here are two papers that were pushed at me. The first one finds a keloid incidence of 7% in African Americans compared to 0.5% in whites. The other finds 0.8% in African Americans and 0.2% of whites. So you can see already just looking at this that we have very different numbers. And this raises the issue. So, and I had this discussion with other editors, how can we talk about what you see in specific populations when the populations aren't specific? Now, this first paper is actually from Canada. They do not document self-reported race. So this was the researcher taking a look at someone saying, that looks African American. Yeah, you're Asian. So there are definitely problems with this. So now this, I'm going to go on a little bit of a limb here. If it's true, is it clinically relevant? Now, I'm going to be very upfront with you and very transparent. My view is it's not clinically relevant for first and second year medical students. And I think the societal harm that we do by drumming into them again and again, it's more common in blacks, which we know happens because due to systemic racism and the exposure to stress and toxins, lack of access to health, it's going to be higher in these populations. So I don't believe that this is something we need to be teaching first and second year medical students. I don't think it's useful. But let's look at something. I'm going to tread very lightly in the direction of Dr. Astor. So let's look at multiple myeloma. In several books in Up to Date, it says it's twice as common in blacks as in whites. And so here we have the approximate incidence as reported in Up to Date, about 6 in 100,000 European Americans and 12 in 100,000 African Americans. So this is a rare disease. I know to hematopathologists, it's much more common than it is to soft tissue pathologists, but it's a rare disease. Now, why is it important for students to know this? And are we leading them astray if we say something like it's twice as common, which makes it sound it's very significant? So one reason why it's important, I've been told, to include this race-based information is because it will help build the differential diagnosis. If you know this person is of African descent, it's more likely it's multiple myeloma. Okay, it's very rare. You should probably be looking at the symptoms of the lab. Okay, but the other one is, well, when you do your laboratory tests, if you know it's more common in one population, it's going to change the value of your positive predictive value. All right, that's a good point. Let's look at that. So if we look at a laboratory panel, which has got 100% sensitivity and 99% specificity for multiple myeloma, so that's a combination of serum-free light chains and serum peptide electrophoresis, and we want to look at our positive predictive value using, I had an epidemiologist do this, so don't think I'm good at the math. Looking at this particular incidence, this is what we see. Our positive predictive value is going to be 0.6% and 1.2%. Because how do we make the diagnosis? We don't pull in 100,000 European Americans, 100,000 African Americans, and say, you know, 6 of you have this, 12 of you have that one, go find it. What we do is we look at the patients and the symptoms they present with, and we use things like morphology and radiology to come up with our diagnosis. But this is what it says. For unknown reason, it occurs more frequently in the United States in people of African descent. So this brings us to the next realm we need to look at, which is inclusivity. So for the residents in the group, you're probably looking at this, the medical students, you're trying to think, okay, what lesion is that? What's the diagnosis? But others of you are noticing something different. And to highlight that, I will show you a different set of lesions. You'll see the ubiquitous association of keloids with darker skin. We do have some images of lesions in darker skin in the 10th edition, but not many. So what we've done for the 11th edition, and this is beautiful, this is largely with Dr. Astor's support, has been to include multiple images. So this is critical. And so for one example here on the upper left, you can see what we typically describe as the pearly papule of basal cell carcinoma. Well, it actually doesn't look pearly if you have darker skin. And in fact, to me, this looks like it could be a melanoma. We have an irregular border, we have variegated color, we have ulceration. So we need to teach this. Now, and then if you look over here at the classic salmon pink plaques with silvery scale of psoriasis, you can see here that in individuals with darker skin, that's not what it looks like. And if we teach salmon colored plaques, students can miss this. So we not only have added these images, but we have changed the way that we describe them in the text. I think this image speaks for itself. So what we have done for the next edition is to remove the light pink color. I think we could probably do some additional work on this, but it is a work in progress. So the final issue is to provide context. So this is what the sentence says in the 10th edition of Robbins. 2 to 15% of whites have the factor V Leiden mutation. Now we know this is actually genetic, so we want to emphasize ancestry. So we refer to European ancestry, but we want to be clear, right, that this is not a code word. When we say European ancestry, what we really mean is white. We want to remind students that it can be present to varying degrees in other American groups, largely due to population admixture. Why is this important? We all know that heterozygous factor V Leiden mutation can be thrombophilic. And in fact, if you're interested, I recommend reading this article from NPR from 2017. So where are we now? 2 years into creating this. So we're going to begin with how we look at the data. So terminology, how do we address terminology? This is actually somewhat complicated because Black does not equal African descent, does not equal African American. And it actually takes a fair amount of reading and thinking to come up with the correct term. We decided not to include terms like white or Black, and we removed the term Caucasian, which is an 18th century term, pseudoscientific, that originated at the same time as Negroid and Mongoloid. But if we look at this, we have to be very aware of whether we're talking about a genetic disease, so we're looking at sickle cell, for example, or are we looking at social determinants of health, for example, hypertension. Now, this gets even more complicated when we look at our whites, European descent, European American. And I give this example for this. There's a table in Robbins that referred to cystic fibrosis was seen in 1 in 20 Caucasians. So Caucasians was out. So we put in individuals of European descent. I said, you know, I don't know if we can say that. I don't know where these data came from. We need to actually find that because it differs from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. And the other thing is, I don't know if this was done in America, so these European, you know, Americans of European descent, or is this Europeans of European descent? At this point, the editor said, why don't we just use Caucasian? Everybody knows what that means. I said, no, we can't do that. But this still remains challenging. So how are we doing on our disparities associated with socially defined race? Well, we've gone from more than 35 to about 10. And those of you who know me know that I'm not entirely satisfied with that. There are 2 problems with this. So there has been some congratulation. Well, it's better than it was. But there's two flaws with that. And one is that the students who pick up their brandly minted copy of this book in December of 2022 don't know what it was. They know what it is, right? So when Dr. Damon Tweedy says to me, that's fantastic, you've gotten it down to about 10. I'm like, yeah, but you knew it as a constant drumbeat. And now I'm going to have students, I'm the only one of the four of us as course director, and my students are going to come to me and say, what is this race-based stuff here? Now, I can answer that, but what about all the other course directors across the country and actually across the world? And I'll say as an aside, when Dr. Astor referred to the fact this is a global book, I had a resident who went to medical school in Taiwan where they don't have race. She said, everything I learned about race, I learned from Robbins. So one problem is our students aren't going to be satisfied with, well, we got it down to 10, that's pretty good. And the other issue is that we have continued to explicitly or implicitly suggest that there are biological differences between socially defined races. And that reinforces this. So I'm going to give you an example. This is what the sentence was in the prostate cancer section. Clinical features and incidence vary by population, which is true. This is a sentence that was provided by a group of 3 editors who said this is what we think should be put in. And we can see here African Americans die from prostate cancer rate more than double that of non-African American men. So I already have an issue with the non-African American men because it's splitting this into 2 populations which are not, I mean, they're not specific. The other issue, we do get kudos for mentioning the unequal access to screening and treatment. And this was something I was told this has never before been mentioned in Robbins-based pathology. We're mentioning this for the first time. But then we see genetic and biological differences. And to me, I'm like, but we say in the disparity section that there are no biological differences between socially defined races. And now we've got this cognitive dissonance. We are saying explicitly there are genetic and biological differences based on socially defined race. And the issue is that studies have shown, right, we're not confused about what this causes. We know studies have shown if you provide equal access to care, survival rates equalize. So we don't need to invoke genetics and biology. We've done very well in other areas, as I've described. We have various skin types, race-neutral cartoons, description of skin lesions. We have a new section on health disparities. We mentioned social determinants of health, lack of access to care. We've emphasized population admixture. So what have we learned and why is it important for me to share my lessons with you? It's important because we actually initiated something that had never before been done. There has never before been a textbook where the publisher explicitly said, we want to look at this with an equity lens. We brought in an evolutionary biologist, a top flight individual who'd written on race and medicine to consult with us on this. And actually, Dr. Graves and I have co-authored a paper in academic medicine looking at a pediatrics textbook. Several months after that came out online, the American Academy of Pediatrics said we were going to remove race-based medicine from all of our materials, including our textbooks. In fact, they said we're going to look at it with a microscope, which I think is a nod to pathology. So other people are going to do this. So what can we tell them? This is hard. It is unbelievably hard. I mean, it was actually, I actually was very naive. I thought this was going to be very straightforward. I thought, we've got the evolutionary biologist, we've got the data. This is very straightforward. And we also have the overarching thing that we don't really shouldn't be teaching first and second year medical students to be looking at socially defined race. It's not useful. But it was hard. And so this led me to the next question. Why was this so hard? Why wasn't this obvious? And this is what I think the issue is. So this is a Venn diagram of where I think these 2 populations look at race. In the red circle, there is the medical establishment, which I think really does somehow believe there's got to be somewhere a biological component to race. If we just look more, we're going to find androgen receptor amplifications in one population and not another. We're going to find an allele that is expressed just in this population. It's somewhere there, and we just need to find it. On the other hand, you've got decades, actually probably about a century of writings by evolutionary biologists, quantitative and population geneticists, and biological anthropologists say, there's no biological race. What are you talking about, right? And again, I bring up this comment from one of those authors. Variation is continuous and discordant with race. Systemic variation according to continent is very limited, and there is no evidence that the units of interest for medical genetics correspond to what we call races. Now, we may discuss in the questions about the NIH and their views on race, which I'd be happy to do. For those of you who want to learn more, here are 4 references I recommend. The one on the bottom is more specifically for people who are looking at revising textbooks, because we provide a mnemonic to help people evaluate whether race is being used appropriately or inappropriately. This book, Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts, the first half of that is very, very informative. In fact, chapters of this are required reading at Emory University School of Medicine. And although this is not Dr. Gray's most recent book, I think it is an excellent introduction to this way of thinking. I hope it will get easier and we will all be on the same page. This is my list of references, and I will take any questions. Thank you very much.
So before we turn to questions, I just want to say a couple of things. One is, when I mentioned that Andrew is very passionate about this topic, I think that probably came through. You know, great talk, so thank you very much for that. And also, thank you very much for everything you've done for the books. You really brought us a very long way on this particular topic. I think for me, the hardest issue personally is one of the last slides that you put up, where you can't have an NCI-sponsored cancer center unless you have a program in health disparities. And lo and behold, of course, we have major ventures here at the DFHCC focused on multiple myeloma, prostate cancer, et cetera. And so there is this disconnect between what you're telling us, the evolutionary biologists say, and what we actually are being asked to do as professionals. So I'll just stop there and
I'm going to take that.
Open it up for questions, or we'll let Dr. Deva address it.
So this is covered extremely well by Dorothy Roberts' book. So essentially in 1993, we had the revitalization of NIH law that came in pass, which said that we needed to bring in, because up until this point, clinical trials were done in white men, right? And what happened at this point was they said you have to bring in women and you have to bring in underrepresented minorities or underrepresented populations. Now, what the backstory is that there had been a recognition that all of these studies were being done in white men. And there was a very big push to include women. And so in the original drafts in 1990, that's what they were aiming at. And then the National Black Caucus said, wait a second, you have to also account for the fact that you're only looking at white people. So let's be more inclusive. So now you're taking something that was biological. And I'm going to say, we understand that gender is more fluid than we understood, but if we're looking at biological sex, hormones, et cetera, and that's in fact the reason why white men were preferred for research subjects who didn't have these hormonal variations, that we're taking something that was biological and we're appending to that something which is social. And it is critically important that we not become race blind, pretend like there are not races, because as I've mentioned, socially defined race has a tremendous impact on health disparities. We have to collect these data so we can look at access to care, who's being vaccinated, right? Do we have mammograms being available to everyone? How can we increase the health opportunities for these populations? We can use this information if we want to address the social issues. The reason, you may have noticed that I always use the term socially defined race. This is a practice, because if I just use the word race, so many of us shortcut to think it's a biological issue. So we always say socially defined race, Dr. Graves and I. So yes, it is important to collect these data to be sure we have representation. But the problem is in this inclusivity, we're actually creating divisions. So that we're now saying, because I'm seeing just terrible papers where they look at this, nothing is significant, but look, there's a difference based on socially defined race. We can publish this, put it on my CV. The other problem that people fall into is this idea of we've covered all this as social determinants of health. We've got it, and even when we correct for all of these, race is still an issue. Well, 20 years ago, we thought social determinants of health were income, education, and occupation. Well, we now know that because of redlining, that we have greater exposure to toxins in African American and Hispanic American populations. There's stress, which we can't even come close to how do you monitor that? And so I think it's very arrogant of us to say we've excluded all the social determinants of health. So this is very complicated. And yes, you can collect those data. And I highly recommend you read Dorothy Roberts' book. I think that it really does address this in a much more sophisticated way than I can. It is something that we as researchers cannot fall into that trap of saying, yeah, I'll publish this because it's a minimal publishable unit, right? What am I saying? Am I contributing to health disparities, or am I helping to address this?
Other questions? Dr. Lewis?
So maybe a comment and a question. My comment is when I recall reading Robbins back in the early 80s, I guess, one of the things that made it so remarkable was you wanted to go back and reread the chapter, and you learned just as much on the reread. And I wanted to say to you that I heard you give a very, very similar talk online a few months ago, and I had that same feeling, which is that I learned just as much listening again. So thank you. I think it's very much in the tradition of that Robbins approach. My question is a hard one looking forward, which is you showed those two circles. When do you think, or do you think at any point that the evolutionary or genomic circle is going to take over the other one? In pathology, obviously, we feel in cancer pathology, gee, if we understood every mutation in the tumor, we'd understand exactly why this tumor behaves differently from that tumor, even though it might look the same in this and this and this. So from an individual genomic point of view, do you think we're ever going to get to that state?
I really think that genomics, as exciting as it is from a research point of view, that if we were able to do all of that, that would be nothing compared to what the impact we could have through universal health care and providing access to care, childcare so people could get to their appointments, transportation. And Dr. Graves describes health disparities in this country as a solved problem. We know the answer. I mean, we can look, for example, at childhood poverty, which declined precipitously when the government provided additional money during the COVID pandemic. So as intellectually stimulating and interesting as it is to look at that, my concern is for those of you who really want to address health disparities, let's address health disparities.
I think there was another question out here. Yes.
I just had a question. In terms of addressing this in the literature, and this might go to like the two circles of like things I want to change and what I can control. Each sentence that you showed had like 17 different citations that you found and have to go on like a long search, probably took hours and hours to figure out where that number came from. And there's like thousands of these scattered across up to date and all these articles that are being published. So how can you kind of combat that in the literature and forward propagating forward propagating literature to make sure that those numbers don't get really propagated, and then teaching medical students that are going to talk about articles like, well, I found this article that has this citation and that do that citation.
Right. So it's a lot of work, and I'm happy to provide the document that I put together, which looks at all of the ones in Robbins' basic pathology. I would say that whenever you want to include anything that references socially defined race, that you do that deep dive and find out. And I find, it's just easier and more scientifically accurate to not even go down that pathway at all. I think there is a significant role for social determinants of health. And of course, there are genetic issues that we need to be aware of, but we need to remember they're not associated with race, they're with populations. So I think that like advanced specialty textbooks like, the American Academy of Pediatrics or Nelson's Pediatrics can talk about social determinants of health. I think as we're interacting with medical students, we can talk about that. But I think that if we want to not be part of the problem, we have to each be incredibly mindful of what we say and how we say it. And it takes a lot of vigilance to do that. And I think that's necessary because where we are is not good.
Dr. Lester?
So this is fantastic, as we've discussed, I've struggled with this for years in breast cancer, so I'm really glad we now have clearer guidance. I'm just wondering how much of this is an American problem and how much of this is a global? Have you looked at medical textbooks from other countries?
Well, when it comes to pathology textbooks, it's Robbins. So I have in a way. America is fairly far on the spectrum of focus on racialization, more than almost any other country. We are incredibly obsessed with race, and it has to do with our history. And there's a lot that can be said about that, and also why medicine is so invested in maintaining race-based medicine. It's definitely recognized. We've, like I said, in Canada, where we'll be speaking in 2 weeks, it's been recognized as a tremendous issue. They're working on race-based medicine there. We have a tentative invitation to speak in Scotland. So it is recognized that these disparities based on socially defined race are widespread, but far and away, America number one. Number one.
COVID, monkeypox, I will forget. There's one question in the chat from Dr. Kernick. When we can do a comprehensive genetic screening for about $200, is this not allowed call for universal genetic testing rather than racial identification?
Dr. Roberts covers this in her book as well. How we interpret these data is very complicated, and there are certain assumptions that are made. And I will recommend that you read the relevant chapter on, it's called The Allure of Race in Biological Science. So there's an issue of how do we interpret all these data, and to be sure that the way these data are examined is free of racial bias. So, for example, when genome-wide studies are done and they show, oh, look, there's 5 clusters. Look, we naturally fall into these 5 clusters. Well, if you look at the data, it turns out that that's when they restrict the clustering to 6. When you go above 6, there's multiple different possible clusters. So we have to be very careful about how we look at this. The other issue is that as exciting as it is to know someone's genome, right, it's environment times genome. And the environment is going to have a much larger impact. We're not looking for subtle differences here, right? Now, I don't really want to know if I have a slight predilection to one particular tumor or another. When you're exposing people to toxins, to stress, and to lack of access to care, they're going to have a different response even to those genetic findings.
All right, I think we've reached 1 o'clock, so it's time to call it the Robbins Lecture 2022. But Andrea, that was super. Thanks so much.
Thank you.